So thanks everybody who joined this consciousness talks. This pronunciation is consciousness talks actually, and the title is coined by Igor here, and what it means is a double meaning. Consciousness, itself speaks, and also this is a series of the talks. And today I'm going to talk about this initiative that I'm trying to promote, this Asia Pacific Consciousness Network, APCN, and this thing, Consciousness Talks, and followed by Igor and also Brown's talk on attention and the consciousness are the same. And this will be also broadcasted on YouTube right now on live. Okay, so I want to first, go over the motivation of why we are promoting this or organizing this thing. First of all, that the goal of this, initiative is to really provide opportunities for, international interactions. This is, of course, hindered by the COVID, but not only that, even before COVID, within Asia Pacific, probably consciousness researchers have not been actively, interacted much, partly because the main conference has been held in the US or Europe, and at some point we had some kind of initiative like Consciousness Research Network (CORN), but it's been silent over the last 2 years. So we wanted to create this a virtual format to facilitate this interaction. And here's a website that we put, and also if you are interested, please join the Slack to facilitate this community. And primary objective of this Asia Pacific consciousness research is to promote this thing within the Asia Pacific region, and the reason is related to the fact that also within the COVID there has been lots of seminars and online conference happening, but mostly it's centered on the EU time or US time, which is very annoying for us living in this Asia Pacific time zone. So we want to always organize this, thing for the time that is easy for us, like from 9 to 5 p.m. for us, ideally. Of course, we will be open to people in EU or US, but it's the time may not be optimal for them. Okay, and as you may know, ASSC this year, for example, will be held in Israel, but their time is completely EU standard, and it's gonna be like 1 a.m. for us to 5 a.m. It's very difficult for us. So we want to create something that works for us. And for that, of course, the conference is always important to promote in each individual face-to-face conversation. And for that purpose, I want to introduce this thing, Gather, that is here. Okay, now we have 4 people here, and the right side is a static, picture of this thing, and then left side is my, online, presence of this Gather. And what it means, I'll tell you. So the reason why I want to promote this Gather for our purpose is that Zoom seminars and the conference has been quite frustrating, and as you may know, over the last year. One is that it's not possible to do. I mean, it is possible to do the private conversation by using some functions such as break rooms, but it's kind of tedious. Host has to do it, and then there's not so much freedom to do it. And the second thing is that if you want to catch up with anybody, simultaneous, informal conversation is not possible. Like right now, I'm talking, and then not many of you are allowed to talk at the same time, right? And sorry, Brian, maybe you can mute, or yeah, all right, thank you. But so this is an exact kind of thing that is not, ideal for our face-to-face conversation. And on the other hand, Gather allows you to do this actually. So for example, if I come to, let's say, Ariel, and then if Ariel shows up, ring Ariel. Maybe you are muted. Okay, then I'll try another one. Camilo? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so this way it allows only those people who are nearby you can talk to each other. Okay, so this way it allows only those people who are nearby you. Okay, so this way I hope that we can continue to converse in a more informal way. And if you sit in this bench, for example, you are only talking to the people who are within this bench. And if you go outside, then people around you can be only the one that you can communicate. Okay. So there is one gather space that is completely free for anybody, and currently, because we are using the free license, it allows to only up to 25 people, but maybe it's enough for today. So we'll just go with this waterfront version of the gather, and it's right now 5 people, so up to 20 more people can join as well. All right. So. Sorry, but I need to ask you to mute. All right, then that's about gather. And now about consciousness talks. And here I want to initially organize mainly featuring the people who are working on the topic of the consciousness within Asia and Pacific area, rather than inviting some guides from EU or US to facilitate further interaction. And the idea is to have 2 to 3 speakers per session, and per session by that what I mean is roughly like 1 hour. And each talk should introduce this research highlight of each of the group or researcher, and ideally we'll continue discussion on Zoom format, or if you are shy and you want to ask private question, please go to Gather and then ask question over there. Okay. And then at the end of the presentation, all these session will be rolling over to Q&A, which will be all broadcasted on YouTube. As you may know, currently it's already live, and it says 17 watching now. Usually this is always underestimate, so maybe more people are watching right now. And then unless there is any kind of problem in what you said, like please don't use dirty words in general. Otherwise we need to edit it later. And usually things will be live and continue to be available on YouTube. And then I hope to archive this over the next sessions, so that people can see it over the time. By the way, I'm sharing the screen, right? Okay, all right. And then so the question that you asked from Zoom audience, it will be recorded, so just be aware of that. And also I will try to also pick up the questions from YouTube as well, but there will be always a delay for YouTube. All right. And then Gather, I already mentioned about this. Okay. And then about the Gather, there is a very interesting link or blog post on how to use this in here that Ariel found yesterday. And like real conference, be prepared that initially it will be awkward. Even with a real conference, we know that if you're a student, you may not know, but unless you become a postdoc or assistant professor or tenured kind of people, and then you get to know many of the people, it's not that easy to talk to other people or talked by other people. So you may feel loneliness, but this is a kind of thing that happens also in the conference. So just be prepared. And it's in general, I think it's a good idea to introduce your past research and also current interest and future interest about consciousness to promote conversation, and also try to use the real name for both Zoom link or YouTube or gather, so that we can identify you and then promote further conversation later. And then in terms of the other speakers, we have already a couple of people listed or planned. So for now, the plan is roughly like one consciousness talks per month. Next one will be May 18, ATR our radio, and so Caltech's Mohammed Shehata will be talking about mainly neuroimaging side of consciousness research. And then on June 3rd, Shinya Nishida and Shigeki Nakauchi from Japan are going to talk about color-related stuff. And for those who joined the Color Qualia Symposium that we organized a couple of weeks ago, this will be a kind of follow-up discussion about this. And then Marta Garrido from Australia and also Shun Sasai has already agreed. And also there is one person from China also already agreed this month. And either privately or publicly or on gather session, just let me know if you're interested in giving a talk on this format. All right. And then so that's what I said right now. And then if you're interested in helping this, format or sustaining this, activity, please send me email, or better to talk about it in Slack. And this link allows you to join this Slack, and the Slack is here. Here, we have mostly dominated by my announcement so far. And I know that this would happen because not many of you each other will know each other. So in that situation, I know that conversation or discussion on Slack won't happen. But if you see, it's already like 71 people already there interested in consciousness. So if you post some kind of question or post your blog or paper related to consciousness, most likely you will get a good response, as especially as we trust each other by building the community. So please think about this Slack activity as well. All right. Any feedback? I'd be interested in hearing you from using Google Form or Gather or Slack or whatever today, and so on. Okay, and that's pretty much it for me. Is there any question or comments from Zoom side or YouTube side? No question or no comment? That's a bit sad. Maybe Alex, do you want to say? Well, Tom.
Something.
Yeah.
So thank you much for this initiative. I just want to say that I think it's a really good idea to create something on this side of the world. There was ACC in Japan like ages ago,
Right.
in Kyoto. I was there, but yeah, so that's a while back, and I think it would be good to have more regular meetings anyway than just once in a while a big conference. And it seems like, that's my impression, but it seems like the consciousness science is actually developing quite nicely in this area. And I also just saw on Twitter earlier today that Hakwon Lau is moving to Riken. And there's a few of us working on consciousness related topics here at OIS. There's not just me, but also Juntani about machine consciousness, and Kenji Doya also works a little bit on consciousness, and there's other people looking at the effects of anesthetics on neural function and things like that. So I think OIS could actually be potentially a node as in this network, or We have to think a little bit about what it means to get involved in the network as an institutional level. But I think that's definitely something that we can consider because there's quite a few of us here interested in consciousness and related topics.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah, and so Tom, if you have any kind of suggestion for the speakers or topic, especially so far we haven't been able to find many that maybe because I'm Japanese and also I have a innate more dense connection with the Japanese people. Japanese and male speakers are easy to find, but non-Japanese and also outside of Japan, and also females are more difficult to find as a speaker. So especially those people, please suggest that.
Sure. Yeah.
And also the field wise, because my also original field is psychophysics, fMRI, or neuroimaging and computational neuroscience. The other type of approach, such as an AI or robotics or clinical or even linguistic or other type of the approach like mathematics, these are all I try to be inclusive, and we'll see philosophies are also needed topic, and the idea is that if each of the talk is relatively short, then you can skip some of the talks that you are not interested, but just hang around people on gather while you are not engaged in that kind of topic. Okay.
Yeah, we've got a few philosophers and females in our group, so I will encourage them to give a small talk.
That's great. And by the way, I'm also interested in this group of the people in MRB 611. Which group is it?
That's actually part of my group.
Okay.
Apparently, they spontaneously create a social gathering around your seminar.
I see.
Yes.
I see. That's great. Yeah. So I also want to encourage those people to join as a lab or group into the future.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. Any other comments or questions? Otherwise, then shall we go to the second topic, Igor? I'll stop sharing my talk.
I think Brown wanted to mention a couple of words before I start speaking. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. So thanks Nao for organizing this. So I'm just going to quickly introduce myself and then introduce today's speaker, Igor. Okay, so my name is Po-Jen Hsieh, and I also go by the name Brown because my first name, Po-Jen, actually sounds more like Brown in Mandarin. So you're welcome to call me either Po-Jen or just Brown. And in my lab, we study human vision, attention, and consciousness. And I recently moved my lab to the psychology department at National Taiwan University. And before that, I was in the neuroscience department at Duke NUS, Singapore. And our speaker today, Egor Ananyev, he was a student of mine when I was at Duke, Singapore. And he graduated with his PhD in 2018. And after that, he worked with Gary Mouse at Nanyang Tech University, Singapore, until like literally now, because he just accepted a job offer from Apple. So congratulations. And what Igor is going to talk about today is an idea that he has been developing for several years. And the basic idea is that he tries to argue that attention and consciousness are one and the same. But as you all know, the dominant view in the field now is that attention and consciousness are dissociable. So, for example, if you remember Nao's review articles on this topic, you can probably recall his 2x2 table showing that it is possible to have consciousness without attention as well as attention without consciousness. Okay, so in today's talk, Igor will try to convince you that although there is lots of data that appears to support the dissociation of attention and consciousness, but there's actually an alternative way to interpret these data. by claiming that attention and consciousness are actually one and the same. So without further ado, let's welcome Egor and let him tell you his idea. Okay, Egor.
Thanks, Brown. All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So then I'll just dive right in. So here's the title of my talk, Attention is Consciousness. And against the tradition, I won't start with the definition of attention because we all know what attention is, right? So the basic, hang on. So let's start with the so-called dissociation table that Brown mentioned. So we have instances of both attention and consciousness. I'll refer to them as just A and C on my slides. And instances when the two are absent. So no attention, no consciousness. When we are paying attention to something, we are aware of that. So these two constitute what we think of as normal vision. And then we have these presumed demonstrations of consciousness without attention and attention without consciousness. So throughout the talk, I'll keep referring to this table. So first, some facts. Attention and consciousness seem to be related. Consider this couple, for example, a woman and a man in a picture, and another man in the background. This other man you might not have noticed immediately, and this is meant to show that we tend to become aware of things that we actually pay attention to. And in fact, in this case, it's hard to tell a difference between paying attention to something and being aware of it. Another famous example is, of course, the gorilla experiment, where a gorilla enters a scene often unnoticed in a dual task paradigm. And of course, there are change blindness experiments that demonstrate the same thing, that attention seems to be required to observe a perceptual change. Note that none of these effects rely on weak perceptual information. This can all be observed in broad daylight. These are normal scenarios, so to speak. Let's ignore the gorilla for now. So attention and consciousness are also, I think, are related because attention is a prerequisite for binocular rivalry. So Braskamp and Blake have shown behaviorally that disregarding a binocular rivalry stimulus is equivalent to having it removed from view. And this observation was also supported by neuroimaging findings by John and colleagues. And it was also shown that attention is required for other bistable phenomena such as motion-induced blindness. And in this case, attention doesn't necessarily make one stimulus more visible than the other. Rather, it enables perceptual competition itself. So for these reasons, the relationship between attention and awareness needs to be considered in any theory that is serious about explaining consciousness. So let's look at some of the frameworks that we have. The current prevailing view is that consciousness requires attention. According to this framework, only attended content can become conscious, and unattended content can never reach awareness. However, attended content could also be unconscious. This is the controversial bit, or the thing that I argue against. What are some issues with this framework? Well, first, attention doesn't seem to have phenomenology because according to this framework, we may actually pay attention to something we're not aware of, meaning that attention doesn't need to have phenomenology. So all of this, what we think of as differences in phenomenology when we pay attention to things seems epiphenomenal. But it stems from a certain class of empirical findings that I'll get to in a bit. And so even the question of whether attention is placed before or after consciousness is a hotly debated issue. So there's a problem of order. There's another competing framework by Victor Lamy who proposed that consciousness precedes attention, and only conscious content can become attended or unattended, and only attended content is reportable. And I think a related issue is the issue of richness. So in one case, consciousness is so-called poor because it only deals with the information that is handed down to it by attention. And it is attention that deals with vast quantities of information. And in the other case, it is consciousness that is dealing with those vast quantities of information and is thus rich. So let's look at these frameworks, and we can already start asking some questions about attention. So first, are they talking about the same attention here? Because it makes more sense for maybe the first framework to talk about the bottom-up attention, and the second case, the top-down attention, because that seems to be the way things are arranged. And what I'm getting at is both of these frameworks may be in some form valid. It's just that they're looking at different parts of the perceptual pipeline. But as it stands now, they are in conflict with each other. So you can kind of sandwich consciousness in here, combine the two framework. You have attention, consciousness, attention, or something like this. I mean, why not? It seems to be arbitrary which one is placed first. So, and it's not helped by the fact that attention itself is in a crisis. And you can glean as much from this slide. There are so many different attentions that when we talk about attention, we might be talking about something completely different from another person who talks about attention. So what is this crisis of attention? For one, no one knows what attention is. In fact, it's been claimed that there is no such thing as attention. These are two highly insightful articles, and they're just two of a series that talk about attention and some of its problems, such as dualism, such as homunculus problem. So there's fundamentally something wrong with our idea of attention. It's become a so-called selection dumpster. You throw into it everything that you cannot explain otherwise. And it's an explanatory black hole. If you look at the way the concept of attention is used in consciousness research, actually, this is kind of it, if you think about the previous slide. And nowhere is this clearer than the idea of unconscious attention. So before we take a plunge into the lower left corner, let's talk about the upper left corner, the consciousness without attention. So I'm just going to talk about this briefly because it's not my focus. So there's a class of evidence attempting to show consciousness without attention. For example, residual processing in a dual task paradigm in near absence of attention, right? That's Nao's bread and butter. But that residual processing may correspond to residual attention, as argued pretty convincingly, I think, by Cohen and colleagues. Feel free to disagree with me in the discussion. Also, to me, the fact that attention seems to be required for binocular rivalry seems like convincing evidence against the idea of consciousness without attention. So for now, I'm just going to focus on the lower left. So what's this about this unconscious attention? Specifically, how did we, as a field, conclude that we can pay attention to something we're not aware of, against all intuition, and perhaps even logic? The structure of these findings can be boiled down to the following. And this is a very rudimentary simplification, but it could be, there are many more scenarios. But let's say we have a cue, and say that cue is a spatial cue appearing on the left. But this cue could be a scary face, a strong word, or anything that would typically attract attention. A key feature of such experiments is that the cue is suppressed from awareness by a mask. And in this case, it's a backward mask, but it could be any other mask, such as intraocular suppression mask. Then we have the target that is presented consciously, visibly, right? So let's say, in this case, the target appears on the left, which is the same side as the cue. And usually the participant needs to respond to that target. And this response is viewed as an indication of how effective the unconscious cue is. So typically, if you run this experiment, people respond quicker to the target appearing on the same side as the cue as opposed to the other side from the cue. So, and indeed, there are many different studies that fall under this general umbrella. You have kind of unconscious attention. And there are different ways to render stimuli unconscious, including blind sight, which is a special type of disorder. And this is now a slide from his recent talk listing some of these studies. And there are many more, as he mentioned in this talk. But of course, it doesn't matter how many studies there are in this category if they're flawed in the same way. So what's a flaw that I think there is here? What's the problem with such studies? For one, and it's not only me, there are others. So for one, these effects are quite weak. So in order to render the queue invisible, one has to make the queue very dim or the mask very strong. And as a result, the unconscious attention effects typically are quite small. And but that means that even a slight conscious trace of the queue could easily explain these effects without having to allude to something like unconscious attention. So we have to make sure that the queue is entirely invisible. And it turns out that it's really difficult to do. And this criticism of that nature goes back to this 1960 article by Erickson. But it's not until recently that we started to fully understand just how insidious the problems are that he brought up. And so let's talk about the visibility of the queue itself and how we probe it. See, if you take out the target and just leave the queue and the mask, and then instead of asking people about the target, ask people about the queue. Then whatever test you use, you may never be able to detect it no matter how people respond. They are not aware of the queue. For all intents and purposes, it's unconscious. So in such cases, it seems that the queue is clearly suppressed enough by the mask to prevent the queue from being detected. But here's what we're learning about masking strategies. Masking doesn't suppress all features equally. This phenomenon is called feature selective suppression. Even a highly effective mask, such as this Mondrian mask for continuous flash suppression, has a very specific spatial profile. And so it suppresses more effectively those objects that match that spatial profile. For example, squares are suppressed more effectively than circles because, you know, the Mondrian is full of squares. A continuous flash suppression also has a specific temporal profile because it flashes at a specific frequency. And fascinatingly, this means that a moving visual object is actually suppressed more effectively than a stationary object. Not many people know about this, about a Mondrian mask. As long as it's moving at a frequency that matches the frequency of the continuous flash suppression. An interesting study by Han Lungi and Elise. So the fact that the mask can disassemble in this way a visual object into features results in some interesting phenomena, such as, so when you're trying to mask, say, a brightly colored object with a black and white mask, what you see is a color floating on top of the mask without seeing the object to which this color belongs. And this just comes to show that the mask doesn't suppress the stimulus wholesale. Instead, it targets specific features of the object it's supposed to suppress. Some of these features, critically, can't survive suppression. So this is the critical bit. Basically, it's possible that the surviving features of the queue interact with the consciously presented target. Let's keep in mind the fact that the mask seems to fragment suppressed stimuli. The queue, if we combine the mask and the queue kind of in the same kind of percept, the queue may not be visible by itself because it's suppressed by a mask, right? But that doesn't preclude some traces of the queue to linger. So when the target comes along, it binds to those perceptual traces. So let's call this perceptual conflation. The queue and the target are conflated or confused with each other because of their temporal and spatial proximity. So this explanation, you may argue, if valid, it only applies to kind of some very simple perception scenarios like this one here. But actually, a similar explanation was used to account for semantic priming effects. Norris and Kinoshita in 2008 argued that this is what happens in mask priming. Perceptual system is tricked into treating the prime and the target as a single object. So this is what I think is happening with the queue and the target. It's just conflated because of spatiotemporal proximity. So, and if you think about visual perception in general, conflating perceptual information without regard to its origin is one of its hallmarks. If you think about post-diction, like this phenomenon of backward filling in, where perception of a later stimulus actually modifies the perception of an earlier stimulus. So this interaction between the cue and the target, in our case, could be viewed in the same light. Although in this case, the perception of the cue is fragmented, so it's only salvaged if there is a target that latches on to the remaining traces of the cue. And that's what we pick up behaviorally. Now, this may be the only takeaway here. You can just take this and be done with it. So in order to explain mass cueing, we don't really need unconscious attention. But this is where I'd like to go a little bit into speculative territory to kind of think about what this may mean for attention and consciousness, hence the provocative title. So the criticism of over-interpreting unconscious findings is as old as the unconscious findings themselves, like the Erickson article from 1960. But more recently, Perichet and Winter, in their article, argued against the idea of what they call powerful unconscious. They say the only thing we really need to explain such phenomena is giving consciousness some credit. So to illustrate, I'll use Merleau-Ponty's example. You enter a room and you get a vague sense of disorder. Only later do you realize that this is because of a crooked picture on the wall. So does this mean that this first intuition of disorganization was unconscious? No, it's part of the conscious experience. And consciousness is capable of such subtleties without having to attribute every single detail to specific visual objects. So also relatedly, in a recent article by Ian Phillips, he argued that the phenomenon of blind sight is best conceived of as qualitatively degraded yet conscious vision. So the bottom line is, just because vision is non-standard or subtle shouldn't make it unconscious automatically. We should try and explain it first in terms of conscious phenomena. So if we look back at this table, my argument is that we don't have convincing evidence of attention without consciousness. These instances could simply be little attention with little consciousness. And this opens up a pretty interesting possibility that this is all one continuum of attention and consciousness proportional to each other. So we actually have a definition of attention that's consistent with this view. We just never seem to read it in full. Everyone knows what attention is. It is taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence. So essentially, my explanation is consistent, I think, with William James's intuition about attention. So let's do a little exercise based on this. So let's temporarily agree with Anderson's radical proposition that there is no such thing as attention. And let's think about how consciousness could do all those attentional things without bringing up attention at all. So this is just a mental exercise. It's not a way to discard attention. In fact, it's an attempt to save it, because consciousness has one thing that attention doesn't have, which is phenomenology. And I think this is critical to thinking about attention. And this is different from asking whether consciousness and attention are the same. Contrary to my title, I don't think this is a very fruitful question to ask, because we're asking this already assuming that the two are different by definition, the two are targeted by different sets of tests, and of course it's going to be different. We're looking for different correlates, we're going to find them because we associate those correlates with different tasks and different activities. So the critical question I want to actually address is, can consciousness regulate itself? So the first prerequisite for this is that different intentional states should correspond to different conscious states. So say we have a scene with two objects and we pay attention to one object, this should be different from a mental state where we're paying attention to the other objects. So the two scenarios are different in terms of their consciousness. And I know it's quite an assumption to make, but maybe it's easier to swallow if you think about the gorilla. Noticing that there is a gorilla versus not noticing that there is a gorilla. It should feel pretty different experientially. It should lead to different phenomenologies. So in psychophysical terms, this could also be related to a finding that focally attending a stimulus modifies its perceived contrast. So how would consciousness go about performing the selective function by itself? Say we're trying to explain bottom-up queuing. So on a basic level, we have a time across x-axis. Typical explanation would be attention at the current time t informs a conscious future state at t plus 1. So, but remember, there's no such thing as attention. We're doing this exercise. So there's just the conscious awareness of the cue. And that conscious awareness is apparently facilitative of the conscious awareness of the target at the next point in time, as long as it appears in the same location and not the opposite location. So essentially, being conscious of something makes it easier to be conscious of something related at the next point in time. In other words, our current conscious state informs and constrains a future conscious state. It's just, we typically call this dynamic function of consciousness attention, but it's all the same stuff. It's stemming from the same mechanism. So, and there is no reason for this to all be bottom up. Our goals are a part of our mental states, and those should inform our future mental states as well, in that they are more compatible with some future states and not others. Same difference, same idea. So to maybe formalize this a bit, inputs of different strengths correspond to different conscious states, and constrain what we can do with those states on behavioral level. So at the same time, our mental states make it easier for certain other mental states to emerge, and that is self-regulating function. And this doesn't preclude some truly unattended unconscious stuff from happening, such as reflexes. And I think there are already models that clarify and kind of work out a lot of those kinks pretty well. So this is a very rough model, but I think that this is second to last slide, by the way. Sorry, it's taking so long. So models such as predictive coding can explain the shifts of consciousness in binocular rivalry. But those models are found to be mathematically identical to the models of biased competition in visual attention. And this was acknowledged by Feldman and Friston, who said there is no tension between biased competition and predictive coding. So this is very important. If biased competition can explain both the way attention and consciousness behave with the same mathematical framework, is there any valid reason to ascribe different things to attention and consciousness? So to summarize, in order to explain the so-called unconscious attention, we don't need a powerful unconscious. We just need a subtle consciousness operating in this gray area that may, in some instances, conflate perceptual information. And this is the key point. But I think it should change the way we think about attention and also consciousness, because remember, attention is in a bind. We need to rethink it. There's something fundamentally wrong with how we are thinking about it. And consciousness could be the key to resolving this. If attention is truly proportional to consciousness, then consciousness can be thought of as regulating itself. We can call this self-regulating function attention. And consciousness now becomes the phenomenology of attention. So, thank you for your attention to consciousness. Sorry, I went over time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. So does anybody have any questions or comments? I can also take a look at YouTube comments as well. It will have there will some delay. Maybe
So
would be great if you have any questions first.
I can say something.
Yeah, please, Tom.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I really like the way you systematically dissected this relationship, and I think your conclusions are sound, and they resonate a lot with the continental tradition in philosophy, the Husserlian phenomenology. So if I think about what Francisco Varela was doing with time consciousness, for example, it was pretty much about consciousness being a recursively nested structure, and that through this recursively nested structure then has some sort of directionality towards certain aspects that are coming in from the future. And so I mean, you didn't mention it in your talk, but are you aware of that work, or?
So could I get the name again? Because
So, I mean, the original work comes from Husserl, who was working on time consciousness, but then Francisco Varela later put it into the context of neurophenomenology, looking at let's say the dynamics of neural activity and how it could be described as a recursive process where current activity somehow gets unfolded in past activity and thereby creates a continuum that points towards the future.
Yeah, this idea is actually, I think, more common than we acknowledge. And I think it's actually because it's so intuitive that it's just consciousness evolving over time. And this idea that we just need it to allow it to evolve over time. We don't need two separate structures, like attentional state, then informing consciousness state. We just want just introduce the timeline, the dynamic component, and it's going to be able to account for a lot of things with what we think is happening in attention.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, completely agree. So you might enjoy that work because they keep talking about the self-temporalizing of consciousness as that self-constitution of that flow that you're talking about is at the heart of that work.
That sounds really interesting. I keep discovering more and more work relating to this, but it just somehow never sticks. And that's the frustrating bit. And I was trying to, and attempting in my way to bring light to this, that we haven't run out of things we can ascribe to consciousness.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, and then I also hear your worry that it doesn't stick. That's also my experience a little bit, and it's partially because these are so disparate traditions, and it's hard to link these communities, psychophysics and let's say phenomenology and consciousness science, and I guess what would really capture people would be if this new way of thinking about things gives rise to predictions that wouldn't be able to be covered by previous ideas, and that you really have a strong experimental paradigm that then basically says, here's the evidence, these are the results, and they come from this idea of self-organizing consciousness evolving over time.
I have some ideas. Okay. So like when I mentioned masking, if you and the feature selective suppression, I think if you vary the features of the mask as they match to the suppressed stimulus, it should lead to different unconscious attentions, right? So if you mess with your mask, it shouldn't it shouldn't lead to any changes because the stimulus is suppressed per orthodox view. But I think if they're related, then the residual nature of it will be determined by the nature of how mask corresponds to the suppressed stimulus. So it's just that I've never had the time to get to this. I think this is one straightforward way to test this.
Yeah, you're right. So if you're messing with the trace of consciousness somehow, that would be one way of manipulating it.
Yeah. So very nice. Anyone who's still in academia, take it up. I'll be very curious.
Right, okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your comments. Very insightful. Thanks.
Is there any other question or comment? If not, maybe I'll just say a couple of things then. First, I'm curious how you guys, this type of thinking leads to any possibility of explaining why we experience, for example, vision and audition differently. Like, in the case of, your framework or any kind of phenomenology type idea seems to be seeing attention as almost like a unidimensional one transient increase of the arousal or processing. It's just an intensifying processing. And towards the end you talked about bias competition and predictive coding. How can you along this line, even if you progress further, try to explain any kind of qualitative difference of different kind of conscious experience? That's the first thing. But maybe I'll just stop here.
This is it's a very good point, and I actually agree that thinking of attention as a mere amplifier of signal is overly simplistic, and it's bound to fail because of many attentional effects that are actually going against that notion, such as inhibition of return, where you have actually more attention corresponding to less whatever you measure. But that's so when it comes to I think though the framework that I'm suggesting is more similar to what you have in mind, which is we do need to consider the modality of attention. That the time point at the current state, it should inform the future state, and this is modality specific, and this is all related to the phenomenology. So how we construct conscious experience is string together these conscious states across time. So we don't need a modulator such as attention. In fact, it brings about this dualism and homunculus problem that I mentioned. In fact, we just need these conscious states, modular conscious states, specific to a sensory modality, but maybe extending somewhat across them. So I think that this actually a line of thinking is more similar to this. So in fact, I think that actually the geometry of experience and all this from this perspective and the modality of experience, I think it should be considered in how you evaluate what conscious states are more likely stemming from the current state. So I think that's the way to kind of pursue this line of reasoning. I do agree that the idea of amodal attention is somewhat iffy, and it just doesn't correspond to what we experienced and also what we have experimentally.
I don't know if I agree or not. I don't know, but let's see. To go to next question from YouTube. Camilo is asking actually, do you think you can pay attention to, or maybe Camilo, you might want to actually speak on speak from APCN gather.
Well, let me see. Let's see.
I can look at you here, so you are here.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Is that someone calling me? No.
No. I'm asking Camilo to speak.
Uh-oh.
All right.
Is that someone calling me? No.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm asking Camilo to speak. All right. Camilo, do you want to ask?
Sorry, there is a lot of delay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is. So maybe let's address those comments. So what Camilo said on
there is a lot of
YouTube,
delay.
do you think you can pay attention to something without the stimulus being present? Pay attention to color red because something important will come up. Yes. So in fact, this it went by too quickly. Hang on. So if I go to this slide and start sharing my screen again. Hello. Yes, share my screen. This one. So the idea here is that the hang on. Oh, I need to move this. The idea here is that our mental state, say we're looking for a specific target, does have representation in our phenomenological experience. So in other words, if we're looking for something, that mental event should be more or less proximal to what's happening next. This is way too convoluted. What I'm saying is, yes, we are conscious of mental events, and they should be thought of as there's no fundamental difference that I can see. It should just as well constrain future states, just as our bottom-up attention would. So is this clear from? I'm going to check on the so if this is clear, you can type on YouTube. And then can you pay attention without being conscious of the feature being attended, and there are separate ontologies? Without being conscious of the feature being attended. Well, yes. There is a difference between being conscious of a thought and being perceptually conscious. Yes, but that just corresponds to a different level in the perceptual pipeline. So Camilla responded on YouTube saying there's a difference between being conscious of a thought and being perceptually conscious. But again, I don't think that, I think actually attentional states are best thought of as conscious states. So they, in some way, are modal, just like what I talked about with Nao just now.
Okay, the next, Ariel is asking question on chat. Ariel, do you want to speak?
Yeah, thanks Egor for the talk. It's been really interesting. I'm just a little curious as to whether your argument ends up essentially defining consciousness and attention as the same thing at the get-go. And I'm curious if there's any sort of experimental evidence that would indicate to you that actually these two are distinct phenomena. So you mentioned that the experiments that try and differentiate the two have like very small effect sizes. If you had something that had a very large effect size, would that convince you the two were different? Or is there any other sort of experiment that would convince you they were different?
Well, essentially the effects that we're getting so far with unconscious attention are proportional to very small phenomenology, right? You may just traces of an experience can account for this adequately. So I guess if you're thinking about this kind of diagonal line that I've drawn, where attention and consciousness are proportional, if you see something off that line, which has been the claim all along, that there is attention without consciousness and consciousness without attention, then yes, that would be convincing evidence. But so far, I see no reason to think that those two things are off the diagonal. Attention and consciousness seem to be related and proportional to each other. So in that sense, there is merit in maybe seeking very large effect sizes, but it's just it hasn't happened at all. So I don't think it's possible, but you know, it's okay to look for such evidence. And then the other point is that attention and consciousness, am I defining them in terms of each other just by definition? Is this a trick I'm doing? You could think of it even this way. I don't specifically disagree, but attention hasn't worked for us. The idea that we have of attention has not worked for us. And I hope I convinced you. There is a real crisis in how people think about attention in cognitive psychology. We seem to be all over the place. We seem to be referring to different things. We seem to plop it, you know, before or after consciousness. It's not a fruitful idea. And I think that if our definitions can constrain the notion of selective processing to something feasible and tie them to phenomenology, I think this is a good starting point. And if there's no evidence against that notion, then I think we're actually more compelled to keep to that idea, as opposed to having two distinct phenomena, attention and consciousness, doing their own little things, existing independently, only in the lab. But the truth is, there is merit to what we think is happening, on an intuitive level. And I think there is a merit to William James's definition of attention. There is merit to this whole school of thought that ties attention and consciousness. Yeah, so in that sense, I don't think this is just a trick.
Okay, maybe for those people who want to ask further question in a private session, please go to APCN Gather. I pasted on again link and also password in the chat. So go there, and then Igor and also I'll be there, and I'll stop broadcasting YouTube here. And thanks everybody for joining, and also Igor especially about that talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Nao.